Is there anybody here who doesn't love Zoro? Probably not. We all love him. He is the captain's right hand. But there is something you doesn't know. Zoro character is one of the best not only in One Piece but also in the entire anime history. You might be wondering how can Zoro be the best character in the entire anime history. Let me explain to you on that. Listen to me closely. Get rid of all the distractions in your life and focus only on what I'm going to explain to you right now. Trust me, the life of Zoro is more than that you think. Find a comfortable spot and sit down nicely. Relax yourself. Drink some water. Listen to me and sink your brain onto everything that I'm going to say. So listen closely. Let's begin. When I first delved into the world of One Piece, Zoro didn't initially resonate with me. Up until the intense confrontation between Luffy and Usopp in Water 7, I found Zoro's character somewhat elusive, and if pressed, I might have even labeled him as uninteresting. It's remarkable how perceptions can shift. Zoro is introduced and joins the Straw Hats in Volume 1, Chapter 5, but it wasn't until Volume 35 or Chapter 332, significantly later in the series, that I began to truly appreciate his depth. To put this into perspective, the Z portion of Dragon Ball is shorter than the time it took me to connect with Zoro. Initially, I likened Zoro to many of the early characters in Dragon Ball who, introduced early on, seemed to lack the enduring presence in the story due to their simplistic personalities and character designs. I was utterly mistaken, and for that, I humbly ask Oda's forgiveness. Upon closer examination, I now see that I was not only mistaken but also ignorant of a character who epitomizes the subtle, brilliant writing for which Oda is known in One Piece. During my initial read-through, I failed to notice what has become clear to me now: there is far more to Zoro than meets the eye. Music. So why could Zoro be the captain of his own crew? This is a question that has likely crossed the minds of many who have experienced the story of One Piece. Through his physical prowess and level-headed demeanor in dire situations, virtually everyone who encounters Zoro initially finds themselves wondering why he isn't the captain of the Straw Hats. It's a rational question to ask. He's serious, incredibly strong, skilled, and, as we've seen, a natural leader. So why isn't he? An important aspect to understand about all the Straw Hat Pirates is that each has a specific goal or dream. Nami wants to map the world's oceans, Sanji seeks the all-blue, and Usopp dreams of becoming a great warrior of the sea. Zoro is no different. His dream is to become the strongest swordsman who ever lived. To understand him, we must first understand the origin of his goal. Zoro's dream is presented in a flashback, where as a young student learning the ways of the sword, he meets Kuina, a prodigy in her own right. After countless defeats at her hands, including a duel with real swords, Zoro vows with her that one of them will become the world's greatest swordsman and that they will eventually fight each other for that title. Tragically, Kuina meets an untimely end shortly after, but not before sharing this profound moment with Zoro. Did you catch that? It's that last line, that promise made between Zoro and Kuina, that I initially overlooked but is crucial to understanding Zoro's character. Promises are something he takes extremely seriously. For instance, when Luffy first encounters Zoro in a bar, Zoro is sticking up for a kid. This moment, while not shown in the manga, is indicative of Zoro's character. He is notorious and very serious about his promises, a trait that defines him throughout the series. Oda wrote it to be subtle. Often in storytelling, a writer will establish a few key elements before emphasizing their worth later in the tale. The order I presented the information to you here makes Zoro's valuing of a promise evident because I started my explanation with the key moment in which it became important to him. From there, it's easy to see the instances where honesty and promises matter to Zoro. However, in the actual order of events we see in the story, we see Zoro learn of Helmeppo's lie before seeing how much promises mean to him in the Kuina flashback. It's a remarkably subtle but very effective means of establishing payoff. This isn't the only part of the story where Oda performs this narrative sleight of hand. It can be seen numerous times across the entire series. Take the true nature of Luffy's devil fruit, for example. Fans have known for the longest time that he's eaten the Gomu Gomu no Mi, which allows his body to bend and stretch at will. However, after being pushed to his limits in Wano, Luffy awakened his devil fruit's latent abilities, allowing him to stretch far more than just his own body. The hints were there all throughout the story, but they only really become apparent thanks to this revelation. And on a more modest level, this same technique was used to characterize Zoro. Here, in this instance, this is another occasion where the supporting characters in this story offer Luffy the opportunity to shine as a main character. He is designed to fight society's flawed structures. He doesn't care about consequences the same way others do. But what this moment highlights for Zoro is that his life was about to end, his dream was about to end. In the manga, Zoro's flashback with Kuina takes place as the firing squad is taking aim. Moments after the flashback ends, Luffy flies in and protects him. This means that on some level, Zoro now owes both his life and his dream to Luffy, which makes this next sequence even more interesting. Zoro vs Mihawk. This is the first time Zoro gets his shot at becoming the world's greatest swordsman. It's easily the best and most dramatic one-on-one conflict the series had seen up until that point, and perhaps what we would see for quite some time. However, something that will become a running trend with Zoro is how each and every one of his key moments in this series can be tied back to that first encounter with Luffy. The fight between Mihawk and Zoro is flush with all the trappings of what makes fights in One Piece so entertaining. There's an emotional through-line and, in this case, a sense of respect not being handed over out of charity, but instead being earned. One has to remember, despite the live-action One Piece removing his introduction entirely, Mihawk's entrance into the story is haunting in the manga and the anime. It's intentionally portrayed to be this way. This is the moment we realize the scope of the possible danger in One Piece's world, and that sudden and very pronounced shift in tone was enough to make even me, as a reader, hesitate. But Zoro steps up to the plate anyway because, as he said before, the day I decided to be the greatest swordsman, I gave myself up for dead. In One Piece, particularly early on, there was a sense that Luffy and those in his crew were merely children with childish aspirations, that they would have no choice but to turn tail at the first sign of true danger. But here we are, staring down the blade of what is undoubtedly true danger, the first of it in the series. And moments before certain death, after being completely and totally outclassed, Zoro says, honor, conviction, and conduct, despite lacking the requisite strength and skill at this time. These are the qualities the greatest swordsman in the world must possess. Luffy, throughout all of this, looks concerned for his friend and crew member, but more than that, he's aware that he needs to do this alone. He was never going to step in or interfere in a matter so important to Zoro. But once the duel was concluded and Mihawk spared him, we get this scene. Once again, this is a narrative sleight of hand, speaking to an exchange they shared upon first meeting, where Luffy declared his dream and Zoro responded with, "You talk big." This is all to say that to Zoro, words are more than a means of manipulation or coercion, they literally mean something. From the very beginning, he established the ground rules of their relationship, and he wants Luffy to know that when he said he's going to become the world's greatest swordsman, he meant it. When he vowed to be part of his crew, he meant it. And I think that value for someone's word and promises of conviction speaks to how he handles Nami's desertion towards the end of the Baratai arc, how he deals with Robin and Usopp's circumstances later. For Nami, if you skim through their story from their first meeting through to her leaving with the Going Merry, she actively goes out of her way to explain that she's not one of the Straw Hats, and least of all a pirate. Where Luffy is able to read between the lines and see her for who she really is, to Zoro, she hasn't made any commitment to them. And so, when confronted about whether or not they should retrieve her, he says, Nami hasn't made any promise or done anything to gain Zoro's trust at this point, and his dialogue reflects that. It's wonderfully consistent character writing. But it doesn't stop there. From within, Zoro could be argued as the most crucial player in this turmoil, outside of Luffy and Usopp. This moment is so brilliantly crafted that even on my initial journey through the series, I recognized it as a remarkable feat of dramatic writing. In my previous video, I discussed the importance of characters like Zoro in supporting roles and how they, when set alongside the main character, can highlight their strengths and weaknesses. Following the conclusion of Luffy and Usopp's fight, Zoro stands by Luffy, offering him rock-solid support when he was at his weakest, when all of them were at their weakest. However, this was far from the most significant moment for Zoro in this Luffy vs Usopp dynamic. After the fallout of Enies Lobby, right before the crew is about to set sail on another adventure, Usopp returns with his tail tucked between his legs, unable to bring himself to apologize but deeply desiring to return to the crew he loves. Trying to play it off as if it wasn't a big deal, Luffy, by his nature, wants to accept him back with open arms, no questions asked. But Zoro makes an important observation here. He needs Usopp to say sorry. He needs him to admit what he did was wrong because, by joining this crew, Usopp made a pledge and promise. By going into business for himself due to his own insecurities, he spat in the face of all the others who take this vow to each other very seriously, and none take it more seriously than Zoro does. Remember when I said earlier that Luffy and his crew were often looked at as childish and juvenile by those they encountered early on? When Zoro was the first one to look the big bad world in the eyes and live to tell the tale, it isn't a coincidence that he spoke these words at this time. It's just another subtle piece of creative writing that takes this already outstanding and compelling scene to the next level. If there's anything that Zoro epitomizes in this story, it's honor, respect, and legitimacy. When you look at Usopp's disposition and actions during Water 7 and the closing moments of this scene, you begin to see exactly what Zoro took issue with and why. To Zoro, words matter. Vows matter. Zoro does care about Usopp, but in the scene, he impresses upon Luffy that if they don't hold themselves to any substantial standard and simply accept Usopp back without any acknowledgement of wrongdoing, then what right do they have to call themselves serious pirates? And you know, he raises a really good point. Having disrupted the order of the crew for reasons brought on by his own unaddressed insecurities, Usopp challenged Luffy's position as captain. This had been a running gag since Usopp first joined the crew and was, in fact, one of the first things he said after accepting this position. This is perfectly in line with Usopp's established character at the time and plays a significant role in his growth over the course of the entire series, a young kid playing pirate with his friends, learning to become a great warrior of the sea. With his crewmates. In this moment, Zoro forced Usopp and Luffy to grow toward their respective goals. In the closing pages of chapter 483, having finally dispensed with Thriller Bark's Moria, one of the 7 warlords of the sea, Luffy is left totally out of commission, drained from their encounter, aptly titled, The End of the Dream. This chapter contends with the aftermath of Moria's twisted control over the inhabitants he's enslaved. The title clearly speaks to this obvious plot element. However, for me, there's something a little more poetic going on here with that title. It's worth mentioning that on a narrative level, Kuma's abilities are intentionally framed as terrifying and monstrous, totally shrouded in mystery. This is to serve and supplement a number of different elements in the story. However, during this encounter, it's to emphasize Zoro's bravery, nerve, and conviction. I mentioned that Zoro, like every other Straw Hat, has a dream he's striving towards. At the beginning, I even said and seemed to prove that his goal was, in fact, to, in the name of his friend and rival Kuina, become the greatest swordsman to have ever lived. But that wasn't exactly right either. While it's true that Zoro's primary dream since he was a kid was this, and he has made enormous efforts to achieve that, I don't think it's his primary goal any longer. Few places emphasize this fact greater than the end of Thriller Bark. Following the arduous adventure through Thriller Bark, fighting oars and navigating this area, the crew, but particularly Luffy, is physically spent. He gave everything he had and then some to overcome that monster. And that's when something totally from left field blindsides the entire crew. Kuma, like Mihawk earlier, shows up unexpectedly to test their mettle. Like much of what makes One Piece famous, it isn't the artwork, action, or even necessarily the choreography that elevates this scene to the profound level of fame it occupies now in the global zeitgeist. It's Oda's spectacular writing, brimming with character history and meaning. Zoro is clearly positioned here as the main Straw Hat Pirate after Luffy. He doesn't react childishly to Kuma's initial backhanded compliment like everyone else did. He successfully dodges attacks unlike many of the others and lasts the longest while the others are dispensed of much more easily. But they all do eventually fall. Nevertheless, Luffy is now exposed, lying there without a soul standing between himself and certain death. The first and only meaningful strike landed on Kuma, a strike that reveals animatronic enhancements, came from Zoro. His curiosity is piqued, but there's only one thing on his mind once this happens: protect Luffy no matter what. Even after taking all of that damage throughout Thriller Bark, taking on Oars one-on-one for a while, and then taking on Kuma one-on-one, Zoro was still the only one to get straight back up after Kuma's big attack. Presented with an offer of taking all of the pain in place of Luffy, who at this point simply couldn't take it, told that he would be essentially offering up his own head in place of his captain's. And even when Sanji pushes him aside to offer up his head instead, Zoro once again takes matters into his own hands. There's an interesting conversation to be had here concerning Zoro's motives to accept this in place of Sanji, and I'm excited to discuss it in more detail in a later video. But in essence, it all boils down to motive. Sanji wanted to do it because he saw less value in himself being alive than his allies. Zoro stood up because he felt like he had to, like he was the only one strong enough to. In this moment, Zoro proves that when Luffy saved him all those hundreds of chapters ago in Chapter 5, that every single moment he had after has been a gift, one that's been given to him by Luffy. Zoro, thanks to Luffy, is now free to pursue his own dream again. But since that day, his dream has become second to Luffy's. He is indebted to him forever. Zoro's goal is to ensure that Luffy becomes the king of the pirates. What a wonderful chapter title, The End of the Dream. It certainly was for Zoro. In more ways than many might appreciate, our grand consideration to Zoro is quite possibly and consistently the single most important asset to Luffy on his journey. The quote, "We aren't children playing pirates," and the subsequent actions that reinforce the sentiment aren't coincidence or pieces of dialogue and action patched into the narrative to make him look cool. These are real tangible consequences of the very first interaction Luffy and Zoro ever had together. An ongoing development with the Straw Hat Pirates has been that of their growing legitimacy on the world stage, an evolution from inconsequential dreamers to credible threats to the current world order in this story. But it's important to remember that way before their growing fleet was ever in the picture, before Luffy had even toppled his first warlord of the sea, before they had encountered the horrors of this world and even ventured into the Grand Line itself, before Luffy even possessed a crew, it was the belief of one honest, loyal, and incredibly skilled swordsman that became the catalyst that transformed a wannabe pirate with frankly unreasonable aspirations into the one and only captain of the now infamous Straw Hat Pirates. Zoro granted Luffy legitimacy in that chapter. He made him, for the very first time, a real captain, no longer a kid playing pirate. And Zoro will ensure that remains reality or die trying. There could never have been anyone else up for consideration as Luffy's one and only first mate. Thank you for watching, everybody. There will be more videos dissecting the other Straw Hat Pirates to come in the future. If you want to make sure you see those videos, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon. It helps greatly. Once again, thank you all so much for watching, and we will see you in the next. Take care, friend. Bye.